No one believed the impossible engine could run. Jacob Carter, single father and forgotten mechanic, worked through midnight solving what MIT's engineers abandoned. His calloused hands moved with precision, born from desperation, each adjustment a prayer for his son's future. When the engine roared to life, something shifted in the universe. Hours later, a phone call from MIT shattered his small world. Recognition arrived like lightning striking water. Subscribe to witness how one night of brilliance rewrote destiny. The workshop smelled of motor oil and old coffee, a combination Jacob Carter had long stopped noticing. The scent clung to his clothes, his skin, the very air he breathed each evening when he locked the door behind the last customer and faced the silence. Tonight, that silence felt heavier than usual, pressing against his shoulders as he stood before the engine that had defeated every mechanic in the city. It sat on the workbench like a mechanical corpse, its chrome surfaces dulled by months of frustrated handling, its intricate components exposed like the organs of something once alive. The other mechanics called it cursed, impossible, a waste of time. They had walked away with dismissive waves and muttered complaints, returning to simpler jobs that paid without demanding too much of the soul. But Jacob could not afford the luxury of walking away. His bank account whispered desperate numbers, and Noah needed new shoes, needed lunch money, needed a father who could promise that tomorrow would be better than today. He pulled his stool closer to the workbench, the metal legs scraping against concrete that bore the stains of 1,000 repairs. The fluorescent lights above hummed their monotonous song, casting harsh shadows that made every bolt and wire seem sharper, more defined. Jacob's hands hovered over the engine, fingers tracing the air above its surface, as if reading invisible blueprints, written in a language only he understood. This was not arrogance, but necessity. The quiet confidence of a man who had spent 20 years listening to machines speak their secret languages. He saw patterns where others saw chaos, recognized the subtle misalignment of components that should have been obvious to trained engineers, yet somehow escaped their notice. The engine was not impossible, merely misunderstood, its complexity a puzzle waiting for someone patient enough to stop forcing solutions and start listening instead. Jacob had always been a listener, had learned early that machines rewarded attention more than aggression, that understanding came from observation rather than assumption. The first hour passed in careful disassembly. Jacob worked with deliberate slowness, removing each component and laying it on the bench in precise order, creating a map of the engine's internal geography. His tools were old but immaculately maintained, their handles worn smooth by years of grip, their surfaces free from rust or neglect. Each wrench, each screwdriver represented an investment he could barely afford, purchased gradually over time when other families might have bought entertainment or comfort. But these tools were his vocabulary, the words he used to speak with machines, and he treated them with the reverence of a musician caring for their instrument. The engine revealed itself gradually, layer by layer, each removed component bringing him closer to the heart of the problem. He noticed the unusual configuration of the fuel injection system, the way certain sensors had been positioned in locations that defied conventional logic. This was not a standard design, but something experimental, perhaps a prototype that had been abandoned when its creators could not make it function according to their expectations. By the third hour, Jacob's back ached from leaning over the workbench, and his eyes burned from the unforgiving fluorescent glare. He straightened, pressing his palms against his lower spine, feeling the vertebrae realign with small pops of release. Through the workshop's grimy window, he could see the street beyond, empty now except for the occasional car passing with headlights, cutting through the darkness. Somewhere in the small apartment above the Chinese restaurant 3 blocks away, Noah was sleeping. His 9-year-old body curled beneath blankets that Jacob had washed in the building's shared laundry room. The boy trusted his father completely, never questioned why their apartment was small, or why they ate simple meals, or why Christmas presents came from thrift stores rather than pristine retail boxes. That trust was both Jacob's greatest treasure and his heaviest burden, a weight that transformed every challenge into a moral imperative. He could not fail because failure meant disappointing the one person whose opinion mattered more than breathing. He returned to the engine with renewed focus, his mind now fully synchronized with the task. The problem revealed itself slowly, emerging from the complexity like a face materializing from fog. Someone had configured the timing system incorrectly, had assumed certain tolerances that the components could not actually maintain. The error was subtle, the kind of mistake that required both technical knowledge and practical experience to recognize, existing in the gap between theoretical engineering and real-world application. Jacob felt a familiar satisfaction bloom in his chest, the quiet joy of understanding something that had confused others. This was his gift, his talent, the thing that made him valuable despite lacking formal credentials or impressive degrees. He could see what educated engineers could not because he had learned from machines themselves rather than from textbooks, had spent thousands of hours feeling the resistance of metal, hearing the subtle variations in engine rhythm, understanding that theory was merely a map while practice was the actual territory. The work intensified as midnight approached. Jacob's hands moved with increasing certainty, adjusting, calibrating, reprogramming the electronic systems with precision, born from intuition as much as knowledge. He replaced a worn gasket, cleaned corrosion from electrical contacts, realigned the fuel delivery mechanism by fractions of millimeters until everything sat in perfect harmony. The workshop remained silent except for the sounds of his labor. The click of socket wrenches, the soft scrape of metal on metal, the occasional sharp intake of breath when a component proved more stubborn than expected. Time ceased to have meaning, existing only as the progression of tasks completed, problems solved, challenges overcome. This was the state Jacob loved most, when consciousness narrowed to a single point of absolute focus, when past and future dissolved into the eternal present of hands manipulating matter, of mind engaged in the ancient human art of making broken things whole again. He was not thinking about bills or responsibilities or the uncertain future, was simply existing in the pure experience of competence, of doing the one thing he knew he could do better than almost anyone. The engine resisted his final adjustments with the stubbornness of something that had forgotten its purpose. Jacob felt the tension in his forearms as he applied controlled pressure to a recalcitrant bolt, knowing from experience exactly how much force would secure without stripping the threads. Around him the workshop held its breath, the space itself seeming to understand the significance of this moment. Dust particles drifted through the cone of light above the workbench, moving with the lazy grace of snow falling in slow motion, and Jacob watched them briefly, allowing his mind a moment of respite before the crucial final steps. He thought about all the engines he had repaired over the years, the countless machines that had passed through his hands, each one teaching him something new about the relationship between force and finesse, between knowing and doing. This engine was different, though, more complex and demanding, requiring not just technical skill, but something deeper, an almost intuitive understanding of how components should interact, despite their designer's apparent confusion. He reached for the diagnostic tablet, its screen glowing with lines of code that represented the engine's electronic consciousness. Programming was not his primary skill, but necessity had made him competent, had forced him to learn the digital languages that modern machines spoke alongside their mechanical dialects. His fingers moved across the screen, adjusting parameters, fine-tuning the relationship between sensors and actuators, creating a harmony between the physical and digital realms that the engine required to function. The code was elegant in its own way, a kind of poetry written in logic gates and conditional statements, and Jacob appreciated the precision it demanded. There was no room for approximation in programming, no space for the kind of intuitive adjustment that mechanical work allowed. Either the code was correct or it was not, a binary reality that he found both frustrating and oddly comforting. At least with code you knew where you stood, unlike with human relationships that existed in perpetual ambiguity. The clock on the wall showed 1:30 in the morning, when Jacob finally stepped back and surveyed his work. Every component had been cleaned, adjusted, or replaced. Every connection had been verified, every calibration checked and rechecked. The engine sat before him like an athlete before a race, all potential energy waiting for the starter's signal. Jacob felt the familiar flutter of anticipation mixed with anxiety that preceded every test of his work. This moment always contained two possibilities: validation or failure, success or humiliation. He had learned not to assume outcomes, had been surprised too many times by engines that should have run perfectly but refused, and by machines that seemed hopeless yet roared to life with unexpected vigor. The universe enjoyed confounding expectations, teaching humility to anyone arrogant enough to believe they had mastered their craft completely. He connected the power supply and fuel lines, his movements careful and methodical, allowing no room for careless error at this crucial stage. The engine remained silent, inert, waiting for the command that would either vindicate Jacob's efforts or prove the other mechanics correct in their assessment of impossibility. Jacob's hand hovered over the ignition switch, and in that suspended moment, he thought about Noah sleeping peacefully, about the stack of unpaid bills on his kitchen table, about the slowly dwindling balance in his checking account that measured the distance between stability and catastrophe. This engine represented more than just a repair job. It was a test of his worth, a measurement of whether his skills were sufficient to carry them forward or whether he would eventually have to admit defeat and seek work that paid more reliably but demanded less of his soul. The fear of that surrender haunted him more than any financial worry, because if he abandoned the work he loved, what would remain of the man he believed himself to be? He pressed the switch. The starter motor engaged with its characteristic whir, turning the engine's internal components, building compression, preparing to transform fuel and air into the controlled explosions that powered modern civilization. For 3 seconds, nothing happened beyond that mechanical grinding, and Jacob felt his stomach tighten with familiar dread. Then the engine caught, sputtered, caught again, and suddenly roared to life with a smooth, powerful rhythm that sent vibrations through the workbench and into Jacob's chest. The sound was beautiful, a mechanical symphony playing all its parts in perfect synchronization, and Jacob stood transfixed, watching the diagnostic readings climb into optimal ranges. The engine that had defeated trained engineers, that had sat abandoned for months, now ran with the confident purr of something functioning exactly as its designers had intended. Jacob felt tears threaten behind his eyes, a release of tension he had been carrying for hours, and he allowed himself a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy. He let the engine run for 20 minutes, monitoring every parameter, listening for any irregularity in its rhythm, watching for signs of stress or malfunction. But the machine performed flawlessly, proving that his understanding had been correct, his adjustments precise, his intuition reliable. When he finally shut it down, the silence that followed felt different from before, less oppressive and more peaceful, the quiet of completion rather than the weight of unfinished work. Jacob documented his repair process in the shop's logbook, noting every adjustment and modification, creating a record that future mechanics could reference if the engine ever required service. This was professional pride, the craftsman's obligation to those who would follow, ensuring that knowledge was preserved rather than lost. He cleaned his tools and returned them to their proper places, swept the metal shavings from around the workbench, and restored order to the workspace. Only then, with everything properly concluded, did he allow himself to acknowledge the profound exhaustion that had been building throughout the night. Jacob was gathering his jacket from the hook near the door when the phone rang, its shrill tone jarring in the workshop's quietude. He considered ignoring it, assuming it was likely a wrong number or automated sales call at this late hour. But the mechanic's instinct to answer every summons, developed over years of emergency repair requests, made him cross the room and lift the receiver. His voice, when he answered, carried the roughness of exhaustion, the vocal wear of someone who had not spoken aloud for hours. The voice that responded was female, professional, carrying the crisp articulation of someone accustomed to academic environments and formal communication. She introduced herself as Dr. Elizabeth Monroe from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and those words hit Jacob like cold water, snapping his tired mind into sharp awareness. MIT was calling him, calling this small workshop, speaking his name as if they had been searching specifically for Jacob Carter. The surreal quality of the moment made him wonder briefly if exhaustion had pushed him into hallucination. Dr. Monroe explained that they had been tracking the engine, monitoring its location through embedded sensors that the original designers had installed for diagnostic purposes. Those sensors had remained active despite the engine's dysfunction, transmitting data to MIT's servers, recording every failed repair attempt over the past months. The research team had watched with growing frustration as mechanic after mechanic examined the machine and walked away defeated, unable to solve problems that seemed simple in theory but proved impossible in practice. They had begun to believe the project was fundamentally flawed, that some error in the initial design made proper function unattainable. Then tonight, the sensors had registered something unexpected. The engine had not only started, but was running with parameters that exceeded even the original specifications, operating with an efficiency that suggested profound understanding rather than lucky tinkering. Someone, the doctor explained, had not merely fixed the engine, but had improved it, had seen possibilities that the original engineering team had missed. Jacob listened with mounting disbelief as Dr. Monroe described the significance of the engine he had just repaired. It was not a conventional motor, but an experimental design, incorporating new technologies for energy conversion, part of a classified research project exploring applications that could revolutionize transportation and power generation. The engine had been sent to the garage as part of a test, a way of evaluating whether practical mechanics could service next-generation technology without extensive retraining. The fact that the engine had defeated every mechanic was disappointing but not surprising. What shocked the research team was that someone had finally succeeded and had done so with such elegance that the diagnostic data showed improvements they had not thought possible. Dr. Monroe's voice carried genuine excitement now, the enthusiasm of a scientist encountering unexpected brilliance. She asked questions about Jacob's background, his training, his approach to the repair. He answered honestly, explaining that he had no formal engineering education, had learned everything through apprenticeship and personal study, had simply looked at the engine until he understood what it needed. The conversation shifted then, moving from technical discussion to something more personal. Dr. Monroe spoke about the Institute's commitment to finding talent wherever it existed, about their belief that innovation came from diverse perspectives rather than narrow academic pipelines. She described research projects that needed people who could bridge the gap between theoretical design and practical implementation, who understood machines intimately rather than abstractly. MIT had positions for engineers and scientists, but they also needed people who could make theoretical concepts function in the real world. who could troubleshoot problems that existed outside the neat boundaries of simulation and calculation. Jacob's repair of the impossible engine suggested he possessed exactly the kind of practical genius they sought. The doctor paused then, allowing the weight of her next words to land clearly. They wanted to offer Jacob a position, wanted him to join their research team, to bring his unique perspective to projects that could reshape entire industries. Jacob's mind reeled with implications. He looked around the workshop, seeing it suddenly through different eyes, this space that had been his entire professional world, now seeming smaller, more confined. The tools hanging on their pegboards, the stained concrete floor, the ancient coffee maker in the corner, with its permanent ring of burnt residue, all of it representing a life he had built through sheer determination, but which offered limited horizons. MIT represented possibility, the chance to work on projects that mattered beyond the immediate circle of local customers, to contribute to something larger than just keeping aging vehicles operational for one more season. But accepting meant upheaval, meant leaving the city where Noah had lived his entire life, meant abandoning the familiar structures that provided stability, even if they also imposed limitations. The opportunity was extraordinary, perhaps once in a lifetime, but it came wrapped in complexity and demanded sacrifices he was not certain he could make. Dr. Munro seemed to sense his hesitation and spoke with gentle understanding. She acknowledged that such a decision required careful thought, that life circumstances complicated every choice, that opportunity and obligation often existed in tension. She gave him her direct contact information and suggested he take time to consider the offer properly, to evaluate what it would mean for his life and his family. There was no pressure, she assured him, no expectation of immediate commitment. But she also wanted him to understand that his talent was genuine and recognized, that he had solved a problem that had defeated people with doctorates and decades of research experience, that his contribution was not minor but significant. The Institute would support his transition if he chose to accept, would help with relocation, would ensure that he had resources to manage the change. She ended the call with warmth, thanking him for his time and expressing hope that they would speak again soon. When Jacob set down the receiver, his hand was trembling slightly, and he stood in the silent workshop trying to process what had just occurred, trying to understand how fixing one engine had suddenly opened a door he had never imagined existed. Morning light filtered through the apartment's thin curtains, casting pale rectangles across the worn carpet where Noah sat playing with toy cars. Jacob watched his son from the kitchen doorway, coffee mug warming his hands, his mind still processing the previous night's conversation. The boy made quiet engine noises as he pushed the cars across the floor, innocent sound effects that now carried different resonance given Jacob's recent experience. Noah looked up and smiled, that pure 9-year-old grin that communicated absolute trust, the unwavering belief that his father could handle whatever life presented. Jacob smiled back, feeling the weight of that trust settle heavier on his shoulders. How could he explain to Noah that their entire world might be about to change, and that opportunity had arrived wearing the complicated face of upheaval and uncertainty? The boy had known only this apartment, only this neighborhood, only the small, stable universe they had constructed together after his mother left when he was 3 years old, unable to manage the demands of parenthood and unwilling to try harder. The morning routine proceeded normally, despite Jacob's internal turmoil. He made breakfast, simple scrambled eggs and toast that Noah consumed with the efficiency of someone perpetually hungry from constant growth. They talked about school, about the science project due next week, about whether Noah's soccer team might win their upcoming game. Jacob participated in the conversation while simultaneously conducting a parallel dialogue with himself, weighing possibilities, calculating risks, trying to determine the right path forward. The safe choice was obvious. Decline the offer, continue working at the garage, maintain the predictable rhythm of their current existence. That path offered no dramatic failures because it promised no dramatic changes, just the steady accumulation of days that gradually became years. But safety also meant limitation, meant accepting that this was as far as his abilities would carry them, that Noah would grow up watching his father work himself into early aging without ever attempting something greater. After walking Noah to school, Jacob returned to the apartment and retrieved Dr. Monroe's card from his wallet. The embossed MIT logo caught the light, looking simultaneously impressive and intimidating. He set the card on the kitchen table and stared at it while drinking more coffee, as if the piece of cardstock might reveal some hidden wisdom about what decision he should make. The phone number printed beneath the logo represented a gateway to transformation. But transformations were by nature disruptive, tearing down existing structures to make room for new configurations. Jacob had built his current life carefully, establishing routines that kept them fed and sheltered, creating stability in Noah's existence despite the challenges of single parenthood. Accepting MIT's offer meant dismantling that careful construction and hoping something better could be assembled from the pieces. The risk was real and substantial, the possibility of failure more than just abstract concern. He spent the day researching, using the library's public computers to learn about MIT's programs, reading articles about their research initiatives, trying to understand what kind of world he might be entering. The information was simultaneously encouraging and overwhelming. The institute operated at levels of technical sophistication that seemed impossibly distant from his current existence. The researchers profiled on their website held impressive credentials, had published papers in prestigious journals, spoke languages of mathematics and theory that Jacob had never formally studied. How could someone like him, whose education ended with high school and whose knowledge came from practical experience rather than academic training, possibly contribute meaningfully in such an environment? Dr. Monroe had seemed confident that his skills were valuable, but perhaps she had not fully understood the limitations of his background, had assumed competencies he did not actually possess. The doubt gnawed at him, undermining the initial excitement he had felt during the phone call. Yet the engine repair itself was undeniable evidence of capability. He had solved a problem that defeated trained engineers, had seen solutions that educated minds had missed, had proven that practical understanding could sometimes exceed theoretical knowledge, that success was not luck or accident, but the natural result of 20 years spent developing expertise through direct engagement with machines. Jacob understood on some fundamental level that intelligence took many forms, that brilliance could manifest through hands as much as through abstract reasoning, that creating and fixing were forms of thinking just as valid as analyzing and theorizing. Perhaps MIT recognized this truth. Perhaps their offer reflected genuine appreciation for skills that existed outside traditional academic frameworks. The possibility that he might actually belong in such an environment, that his contribution could be valuable rather than merely tolerated, began to seem slightly less implausible. By evening, when Noah returned from school carrying a graded math test marked with a bright red A, Jacob had begun to see the decision differently. His son deserved opportunities, deserved to see his father attempt greatness rather than settle for adequacy, deserved to understand that potential should be pursued even when pursuit involved risk. What kind of lesson was Jacob teaching by choosing safety over possibility, by declining to even try something challenging because failure seemed probable? Noah needed to see courage in action, needed to learn that worthwhile achievements required willingness to step beyond comfortable boundaries into uncertain territory. The decision was not just about Jacob's career or even their immediate circumstances, but about what values and beliefs he would transmit to his son through his choices. That realization shifted the entire framework of the question, transforming it from personal calculation into moral imperative. Fear of failure was understandable, perhaps even rational, but it could not be allowed to determine the course of their lives. Jacob called Dr. Monroe 3 days later, his decision made, but his voice still carrying traces of nervousness. She answered on the second ring, her tone immediately warm and welcoming, conveying genuine pleasure at hearing from him. He did not waste time with elaborate preamble, simply stated that he wanted to accept the offer, that he was ready to join their team despite his uncertainties about whether he truly belonged. The doctor laughed softly at that confession, a sound of understanding rather than mockery. She explained that most truly talented people doubted themselves, that certainty was often the province of mediocrity, while brilliance tended toward humility. His doubts were not evidence against his capabilities, but rather confirmation of his self-awareness, his recognition that excellence required continuous learning and growth. MIT was offering him the position precisely because his approach to the impossible engine demonstrated qualities that could not be taught through conventional education: intuition, creativity, persistence, the ability to see patterns that others missed. Those capabilities were rare and valuable, worth far more than memorized formulas or accumulated credentials. The logistics of transition occupied the following weeks. The Institute provided assistance that Jacob had not dared to hope for, connecting him with relocation services that helped him find housing near campus, offering an advance on salary that covered moving expenses and security deposits. He gave notice at the garage, and his boss responded with surprising grace, expressing pride that one of his mechanics had attracted attention from such a prestigious institution. The other mechanics were equally supportive, though Jacob detected traces of envy beneath their congratulations, the natural resentment of those who remained in circumstances that someone else was escaping. He understood that feeling and bore no judgment for it, having experienced similar emotions when witnessing others' advancement. Success always contained elements of both achievement and abandonment, triumph over current circumstances necessarily meaning departure from those still embedded in them. Telling Noah required careful navigation. Jacob waited until evening, sitting on the boy's bed after the nightly reading ritual, finding words to explain that their lives were about to change dramatically. He described the phone call from MIT, the offer of a position working on important projects, the opportunity to contribute to something significant. Noah listened with widening eyes, his young mind processing implications that would reshape his entire world. The boy's first question was heartbreakingly practical. Would they have to move away from his friends? Jacob acknowledged yes. They would relocate to Massachusetts, would leave behind the familiar geography of home, and establish themselves in a new place. Tears threatened in Noah's eyes. That instinctive childhood resistance to change, the desire for permanence that reality so rarely accommodates. But Jacob spoke about new opportunities, about better schools, about the chance for both of them to grow beyond what their current environment allowed. He promised that change was difficult but necessary, that comfort often became another word for stagnation, that worthwhile transformations required courage to release what was known in pursuit of what could be. The boy asked if Jacob was scared, and Jacob answered with the honesty he had always tried to maintain with his son. Yes, he was frightened by the magnitude of change, by uncertainty about whether he would prove adequate to the challenges ahead, by fear that he might fail spectacularly in an environment so different from anything he had experienced. But he was also excited, energized by possibility, eager to discover what he might accomplish when given resources and opportunities beyond the limited options available in their current circumstances. Fear and excitement often coexisted, Jacob explained, two sides of the same emotional coin, both indicating that something important was happening. The key was not eliminating fear, but acting despite its presence, refusing to allow anxiety to prevent attempts at growth. Noah absorbed this lesson silently, his young face serious with concentration, and then he asked one more question. Would Jacob still have time for him, or would the new job consume all his attention? Jacob pulled his son close then, promising that nothing would ever be more important than their relationship, that success meant nothing if it required sacrificing the person who mattered most, that they would navigate this transition together as they had navigated everything else. The final weeks in their hometown passed in a blur of packing and farewells. Jacob sorted through accumulated possessions, making ruthless decisions about what to keep and what to discard, understanding that physical lightness would ease the transition. He donated most of their furniture, keeping only items with sentimental significance or practical necessity. The process was simultaneously liberating and melancholic, each discarded object representing some portion of their history together, some moment or period being consciously released. Noah helped with packing, wrapping dishes in newspaper, filling boxes with books and clothes, approaching the task with 9-year-old solemnity. They worked together in companionable silence, father and son engaged in the ritual of transformation, preparing to carry their essential selves into a new configuration of existence. On their last evening in the apartment, they sat on the bare living room floor eating take-out pizza, the empty rooms echoing around them, and Jacob felt the poignant mixture of sadness and anticipation that attends all significant life transitions. The drive to Massachusetts took 2 days, their few remaining possessions packed into a rental truck that Jacob drove with careful attention to the precious cargo of their reconstituted life. Noah sat in the passenger seat, watching the landscape transform outside his window, the familiar geography giving way to new terrain, each mile representing distance from what was known and approach toward what remained undefined. They stopped at roadside motels that smelled of generic cleaning products and featured beds that sagged in the middle, eating fast food meals that tasted the same everywhere, existing temporarily in the liminal space between departure and arrival. Jacob used the driving time to mentally prepare himself for what awaited, rehearsing introductions, imagining his first day, trying to construct scenarios that would help him navigate the foreign environment of academic research. But he also tried to stay present with Noah, pointing out interesting sights, playing word games to pass the hours, maintaining their connection even as everything external shifted around them. On the second afternoon, they crossed into Massachusetts, and Jacob felt his heart rate increase, adrenaline sharpening his awareness as reality approached to meet expectation. The MIT campus overwhelmed Jacob's senses with its scale and purposefulness. Buildings of varied architectural styles clustered together, their facades speaking different historical moments unified by shared commitment to inquiry and innovation. Students moved between classes with focused energy, carrying laptops and textbooks, engaged in conversations that suggested intellectual intensity. Jacob felt simultaneously inspired and intimidated by the atmosphere of concentrated brilliance, the sense that everyone here was pursuing something significant beyond merely fulfilling requirements or earning credentials. He had arranged temporary housing in graduate student apartments, a small furnished unit that would serve until they established themselves more permanently. After helping Noah settle into the new space, Jacob reported to the engineering building, where Dr. Monroe had instructed him to meet the research team. The building's interior was a maze of corridors lined with laboratory doors, bearing cryptic project names and security warnings, and Jacob consulted his directions multiple times before finding the correct location. Dr. Monroe greeted him warmly, her appearance matching the professional competence her voice had conveyed over the phone. She was perhaps 50, with grey-streaked hair pulled back efficiently and eyes that communicated both intelligence and kindness. She led Jacob through the laboratory, introducing him to team members who responded with varying degrees of enthusiasm to the arrival of this unconventional addition to their ranks. Some seemed genuinely interested, asking questions about his background and approach to the impossible engine. Others were politely skeptical, their expressions suggesting reservation about whether someone without formal credentials could contribute meaningfully to their work. Jacob understood this skepticism was not personal, but structural, reflecting the academic culture's emphasis on educational pedigree as the primary marker of competence. He would need to prove himself through results rather than credentials, demonstrating value through actual contribution rather than impressive resume entries. The prospect was daunting, but also clarifying, stripping away ambiguity about what he needed to accomplish. The research laboratory itself was unlike any workspace Jacob had previously experienced. Where his garage workshop had been organized around practical necessity, this space reflected theoretical possibility. Workbenches held partially assembled prototypes whose purposes were not immediately obvious. Computer monitors displayed complex simulations and data visualizations. Shelves contained components and materials that Jacob could not identify, products of manufacturing processes he had never encountered. The gap between his existing knowledge and what this environment presumed was significant, perhaps unbridgeable. Yet Dr. Monroe seemed unconcerned, assigning him initially to observation and familiarization, allowing him to study their current projects without immediate pressure to contribute. She explained that integration took time, that understanding context was necessary before meaningful participation became possible. Jacob appreciated this grace period, using it to watch how the team worked, learning their vocabulary and methods, beginning to map the relationship between what they discussed theoretically and what that might mean practically. His first substantive contribution came unexpectedly during a team meeting about a problematic prototype. The researchers were discussing cooling system failures, debating theoretical modifications that might address the overheating issues. Jacob listened carefully, comparing their descriptions to systems he had encountered in automotive applications. When the discussion reached an impasse, with team members divided between competing approaches, he raised his hand hesitantly and offered a suggestion drawn from his experience with high-performance engine cooling. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward him, and Jacob felt heat rise in his face, certain he had said something foolish or obvious. But Dr. Monroe leaned forward with interest, asking him to elaborate. He explained the principle he had in mind, describing how thermal management in racing engines dealt with similar challenges, outlining a modification approach that combined elements the team had been considering separately. His explanation was not couched in academic language or supported by theoretical citations, just practical knowledge expressed in straightforward terms. When he finished, one of the senior engineers nodded slowly and admitted that the suggestion had merit, that it addressed the problem from an angle they had not adequately explored. The following days brought Jacob more actively into the team's work. His suggestions were tested, his ideas evaluated alongside those of trained engineers, his contributions assessed on merit rather than credentials. Some of his proposals proved impractical or missed important considerations he had not understood, but others worked brilliantly, solving problems through approaches that emerged from his different knowledge base and perspective. The team began consulting him regularly, valuing his ability to translate between theory and practice, to identify implementation challenges that existed outside simulation environments. Jacob felt himself relaxing gradually into the role, finding his place within the group's dynamics, recognizing that his contribution was genuinely useful rather than merely tolerated. The imposter syndrome that had plagued his first weeks began to fade, replaced by growing confidence that he belonged here not despite his unconventional background, but partially because of it, that his different path to expertise provided value that conventional training could not replicate. The most profound shift came when Dr. Monroe assigned him to lead a sub-project focused on making one of their theoretical designs actually functional. She explained that the concept was sound, theoretically, but had repeatedly failed practical implementation, that previous attempts had suggested some gap between design assumptions and physical reality. Jacob accepted the challenge with trepidation, but also excitement, recognizing this as an opportunity to demonstrate his capabilities definitively. He approached the prototype methodically, applying the same observational patience he had used on the impossible engine, listening to what the machine was telling him rather than forcing preconceived solutions. He discovered that the theoretical specifications assumed manufacturing tolerances more precise than the components could actually achieve, that real-world variation created cascading problems the simulations had not predicted. By adjusting the design to accommodate practical limitations rather than fighting against them, by introducing flexibility where the original plan demanded rigidity, he created a version that functioned reliably. When the modified prototype performed flawlessly during testing, the research team responded with genuine enthusiasm. Dr. Monroe looked at Jacob with something approaching vindication, her faith in recruiting him validated by tangible results. That moment marked Jacob's full transition from outsider to insider, from probationary addition to valued team member. Years flowed past with the strange acceleration that characterizes periods of meaningful engagement. Jacob's work at MIT expanded beyond the initial project into multiple research streams, his practical expertise becoming sought after across different departments. He collaborated with electrical engineers on power systems, consulted with materials scientists on component design, contributed to theoretical discussions by asking questions that seemed simple but revealed unexamined assumptions. His reputation grew gradually but steadily, built not on dramatic breakthroughs, but on consistent competence, on the accumulated weight of problems solved and challenges met. Academic publications began including his name, first as a contributor, eventually as lead author on papers describing implementation methodologies for complex systems. He learned the formal languages of engineering and science, acquiring academic vocabulary while retaining his practical foundation, becoming bilingual in theory and application. The boy who had once doubted whether he belonged in this environment now moved through it with earned confidence, respected not despite his origins, but as someone who had expanded the community's understanding of what expertise looked like. Noah flourished in ways that vindicated Jacob's decision to accept the risk of transformation. The boy attended excellent schools, surrounded by peers whose parents valued education and intellectual development. He absorbed the ambient atmosphere of possibility, developing interests in science and mathematics that his father supported with enthusiastic attention. Father and son maintained their close relationship despite Jacob's increased professional demands, prioritizing shared time, establishing routines that preserved their connection. Weekend mornings found them exploring Boston's museums, attending lectures at MIT that welcomed public participation, discussing ideas and questions with the easy intimacy of long familiarity. Jacob watched Noah develop confidence and curiosity, becoming someone unafraid to ask difficult questions or pursue challenging interests, and recognized that the gift of their relocation extended far beyond his own career advancement. By choosing growth over stagnation, by modeling courage in the face of uncertainty, Jacob had given his son permission to imagine a large life, To believe that circumstances of birth did not determine limits of achievement, but Jacob's most significant contribution emerged not from technical accomplishments, but from his advocacy for different paths to expertise. He spoke openly about his own background, about learning through apprenticeship and practical engagement rather than formal education. He pushed against the academy's credentialism, arguing that intelligence and capability manifested in many forms, that excluding people based on educational pedigree meant missing valuable perspectives and talents. His arguments carried weight precisely because he had proven himself within the system, had demonstrated that unconventional backgrounds could produce exceptional results. MIT began modifying its recruiting practices, creating positions specifically designed for people with practical expertise, building bridges between academic research and applied knowledge. Jacob mentored these new hires, helping them navigate institutional culture, advocating for their contributions, creating space for their different approaches to problem solving. This work felt more important than any single technical achievement, representing systemic change rather than individual accomplishment. He established scholarship programs targeting young people from circumstances similar to his own, creating pathways for talented individuals trapped by economic limitation or educational access. The programs did not simply provide financial support, but offered mentorship, helping recipients develop confidence to pursue opportunities that might otherwise seem impossibly distant. Jacob interviewed applicants personally, looking not for perfect academic records, but for evidence of curiosity, persistence, and creative problem-solving. He funded these initiatives partially through his MIT salary, but increasingly through speaking fees and consulting work. His story of transformation from mechanic to researcher, resonating with audiences interested in redefining expertise and talent. The scholarship recipients sent him updates on their progress, letters describing how the support had enabled advancement they had not believed possible, and these communications provided satisfaction deeper than any professional recognition. He was not just succeeding individually, but multiplying his success through others, creating ripples that extended far beyond his direct reach. The impossible engine that had changed his life remained in MIT's collection, preserved as a teaching tool and reminder of how problems sometimes require unconventional solutions. Jacob occasionally visited it, standing before the machine that had been the hinge point of his transformation. The engine looked ordinary now, just metal and electronics, its significance invisible to anyone unaware of its history. But Jacob saw in it something more, evidence that ability existed everywhere, waiting only for opportunity and recognition. He thought about all the talented people whose potential remained unrealized because circumstances never provided them the chance to demonstrate capability, because gatekeeping systems excluded them before they could prove their worth. His life could easily have followed that trajectory. Remaining confined to the garage workshop, his abilities appreciated only within the small circle of local customers, never tested against larger challenges or given resources to achieve full expression. The accident of that one engine, the chance that MIT had been monitoring it, had created a doorway that should not have been dependent on chance, but rather accessible through intentional structures and systems. On evenings when work released him early enough to walk through campus before heading home, Jacob sometimes stopped to watch students hurrying between classes, their faces bright with purpose and possibility. He recognized the privilege they inhabited, often unconsciously, the advantage of educational access and institutional support. But he also recognized that privilege was not inherently wrong, merely unfairly distributed. The solution was not to resent those who had opportunities, but to expand access until privilege became universal rather than exclusive, until anyone with talent and determination could find pathways to full development regardless of their starting point. His work, his advocacy, his very presence at MIT represented small movement toward that larger goal. He was one person, his influence necessarily limited, but even individual examples mattered because they demonstrated possibility, proved that alternative paths existed. The story of the single-dad mechanic who fixed the impossible engine and was recruited by MIT circulated widely, inspiring others to attempt their own transformations, encouraging institutions to reconsider their assumptions about where talent resided and how it should be recognized. That narrative impact, the cultural work his story performed, might ultimately matter more than any specific technical contribution he made during his career. He had become not just a researcher, but a symbol, living evidence that the impossible was merely the difficult awaiting someone stubborn enough to attempt it.